Judge Prescott thought a fine would silence Pam Bondi. He never expected her to dismantle his argument in front of the entire courtroom. Tampa's courthouse had seen its share of legal battles, but on this particular morning, no one anticipated the storm about to unfold. Pam Bondi, sharp as ever, stepped through the heavy wooden doors, briefcase in one hand, the other adjusting the lapel of her blazer. This was routine, an argument she could make in her sleep. She felt the judge's eyes on her before he spoke. Judge Alan Prescott, known for his no-nonsense demeanor, wasn't looking at her face. His gaze rested just below her collarbone, the simple gold cross around her neck. The air in the courtroom shifted. "Miss Bondi," Prescott said, his tone as sharp as a gavel strike, "religious symbols have no place in my courtroom." Pam barely blinked. "Your Honor, that cross violates the neutrality of this space. Remove it or face a fine." A murmur rippled through the spectators. The bailiff shifted. The clerk darted a glance at the judge, then back at Pam. She didn't move. "I'm sorry, Your Honor, but my cross is no different than a wedding ring or a locket with a family photo inside." Prescott's face remained unreadable. "That's not how I see it. Either remove it or I issue a fine." For the first time in her career, Pam Bondi was fined. Not for misconduct, not for a procedural violation, but for wearing a piece of jewelry. The fine wasn't the issue. It was what it represented. She folded her hands over her briefcase, her expression cool. "Before we proceed, I'd like to address this formally." Prescott raised a brow. "Address it?" "Yes. I'll be filing an objection and would like to state my argument on record." The judge smirked, glancing at the clock. "Miss Bondi, this hearing is about a business dispute, not your personal grievances." Pam didn't flinch. "And I'm aware the First Amendment doesn't take a recess for personal opinions." That got his attention. He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. The court reporter's fingers hovered over the keyboard. The room was tense, not because of the case, but because an attorney had just challenged a judge's authority to his. Face Pam knew she was walking a thin line, but backing down wasn't an option. "You're fining me for wearing a cross," she said. "Let's break that down legally, shall we?" Prescott exhaled, rubbing his temples. But before he could speak, Pam was already reaching into her briefcase. She wasn't just going to argue. She was about to dismantle his entire premise. Judge Prescott didn't realize just how deep a hole he had started digging. Pam pulled out a single sheet of paper, placing it carefully on the table. Every movement was deliberate. Every second of silence tightened the tension in the room. "Miss Bondi," Prescott sighed, "I don't have time for theatrics." "Neither do I, Your Honor. But what I do have is a firm understanding of constitutional law." The judge laced his fingers together, bracing for what was coming next. "You're fining me for wearing a cross, claiming it violates courtroom neutrality." Pam tilted her head slightly. "Tell me, Your Honor, what legal precedent are you basing that on?" Silence. The court reporter's fingers hovered. The bailiff barely shifted. Prescott let out a slow breath. "This courtroom operates under my authority, Miss Bondi." Pam nodded. "It does. But that authority is not above the Constitution." She tapped the paper in front of her. "And under the First Amendment, personal religious expression is protected, especially when it does not disrupt proceedings." The judge scoffed. "You're an attorney, not a law professor." Pam smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Then let's talk case law." She lifted the paper. Tinker v. Des Moines, 1969. A landmark case establishing that individuals do not shed their constitutional rights when they enter a government institution, whether that's a school or a courtroom. Prescott's jaw tightened. Pam Bondi wasn't just making a case. She was winning it. He knew that case. Everyone in the legal field did. Pam didn't stop. West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett, 1943. Her voice was steady, unwavering. The Supreme Court ruled that compelling individuals to remove or hide symbols of personal belief is a violation of their First Amendment rights. She set the paper down, her eyes locked on the judge. "Now, Your Honor, would you like me to keep going, or would you prefer to reconsider that fine?" Judge Prescott's fingers tapped against the armrest of his chair. He was cornered, and he knew it, but his pride wouldn't let him concede. Not yet. This is not a religious debate, Miss Bondi. Pam tilted her head. Then why did you make it? One? A few quiet gasps rippled through the courtroom. Prescott's face darkened. His voice remained sharp, but his authority was slipping. Pam leaned forward. With all due respect, Your Honor, I'll stop when I receive a legal justification for this fine, because so far I haven't heard one. A long pause. Then finally the judge looked at the clerk. Mark the fine as pending review. Pam smirked. I'll take that as a temporary victory. But she wasn't done. The real fight was just beginning. Prescott's expression was unreadable, but the way he shifted in his chair spoke volumes. He had expected quiet compliance, not a full-blown constitutional challenge. The air in the courtroom wasn't just tense anymore. It was electric. Pam could feel it. Every set of eyes was on her, watching, waiting. She had drawn a line in the sand. Now the judge had two choices: stand by his weak justification and risk humiliation, or find a way to backtrack without losing control. But Prescott wasn't the type to back down easily. Miss Bondi, he began, his tone measured. Courtroom rules exist for a reason. If I allow one form of personal expression, I open the door to all of them. Pam's lips pressed together. You mean like the wedding bands worn by half the attorneys here? Or the lapel pins you allow on government officials? Prescott's jaw tightened. Pam didn't let up. Or let's talk about the time you allowed a defense attorney to wear a pink ribbon for breast cancer awareness during a trial. You had no issue with that. Murmurs broke out among the observers. Prescott shot them a glare, but the damage was done. Pam had just exposed his selective enforcement. She sat back, crossing her arms. So tell me, Your Honor, why does this rule apply only to my cross? Prescott's fingers curled around the edge of his desk. He was trapped, and everyone in that courtroom could see it. He had enforced an unwritten rule based on personal bias. And now it was crumbling beneath him. For the first time since the hearing began, he didn't have a response. Pam didn't need to gloat. She just let the silence stretch, long enough for everyone to absorb the reality of the situation. Then, she delivered the final blow. If you stand by this fine, Your Honor, I will be filing an appeal before the ink dries on the ruling. And when that happens, I guarantee this case will make headlines. She let that sink in. A sitting judge fining a woman for wearing a cross in court. I'm sure the higher courts would love to weigh in on that precedent. Prescott's nostrils flared. His ego and his pride were fighting a war against cold, hard reality. Pam didn't look away. She let him sit with it. The longer he delayed, the more obvious his mistake became. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he exhaled sharply. The fine is rescinded, he muttered. Pam smiled. Much appreciated, Your Honor. But this wasn't just about a fine anymore. She had just sent a message, loud and clear, one that Prescott wouldn't forget anytime soon. But the fallout? That was only just beginning. The judge's words, "The fine is rescinded," should have ended it. But the courtroom wasn't just a legal battleground anymore, it was a spectacle, and everyone present had just witnessed something they wouldn't forget. The court reporter barely looked up from her keyboard, but even she knew this transcript would circulate far beyond these four walls. The clerk, who had looked uneasy when the fine was first announced, now stole a quick glance at Pam. Almost as if impressed, Prescott straightened his papers, as if he could physically erase the moment. But Pam knew better. This wasn't something he could brush aside. The silence was deafening. Pam calmly adjusted her blazer. The small gold cross still in place, exactly where it had been the entire time. She had won. But now, she needed to make sure this wasn't just a personal victory. It had to mean something more. She turned to her client, the middle-aged business owner who was the actual reason for this hearing. It was time to get back to work. The man gave her a barely concealed nod of respect, his confidence in her only growing stronger. Pam knew this wasn't just about her anymore. Outside the courthouse, the reaction was immediate. A reporter, one who had been covering an entirely different case in the same building, caught wind of what had just unfolded. Within an hour, a local news site posted the headline, "Florida judge attempts to fine attorney for wearing a cross, but it doesn't go as planned." Pam's phone buzzed. Then again. And again. Colleagues, former law school classmates, journalists, everyone wanted to know what had happened. But Pam wasn't interested in headlines or media spins. She had a bigger picture in mind. This wasn't just about a courtroom skirmish. She knew cases like these had ripple effects, whether she intended them to or not. This wasn't just about one judge or one attorney anymore. This was about precedent, one that hadn't yet been set, but very well could be. Would other judges try the same? Would attorneys feel pressured to leave personal symbols at home to avoid confrontation? Would this moment embolden others to push the boundaries of courtroom neutrality in ways that targeted personal beliefs? Pam wasn't going to let that happen. By evening, the story had already taken on a life of its own. A well-known legal commentator on a conservative news station brought it up during a panel discussion. On social media, heated debates erupted, some backing the judge's stance, others seeing Pam's defiance as an important stand for constitutional rights. Pam sat in her office, watching it all unfold on her phone. A producer from a national news network had already reached out requesting an interview. She exhaled slowly, rubbing her temple. She had spent years fighting for clients, holding her ground in high-stakes cases. But this was different. This wasn't about corporate disputes or criminal defense. This was about personal freedoms, and whether they could be stripped away at the whim of a single judge. And Judge Prescott wasn't done with her yet. She could feel it. Even as she had left the courthouse, she had caught the look he gave her, before banging the gavel and dismissing the session. He might have rescinded the fine, but his expression had carried something else, an unspoken challenge. Pam wasn't sure what form it would take, but she knew this battle was far from over. She had expected some fallout, a few emails, maybe a couple of calls from colleagues weighing in. What she hadn't expected was the sheer speed at which everything escalated. By the time she walked into her office the next morning, her assistant, Lauren, was already waiting, concern etched across her face. "You need to see this," she said. Holding up her tablet, Pam took it, scanning the screen. The Florida Bar Association had just issued a statement, carefully worded, neutral in tone, but unmistakable in its implications. Judges have the right to maintain decorum in their courtrooms. While attorneys are afforded personal expression, it is important to respect the roles set forth by presiding judges. We trust our judicial system to navigate these matters with fairness and integrity. Pam let out a slow breath. This wasn't just a comment, it was a warning. Respect the rules set forth by presiding judges. That wasn't just a general statement, it was a signal. The legal world was tight-knit. The Florida Bar rarely commented on courtroom disputes, unless they had reason to believe a situation was spiraling. This meant Prescott wasn't just bitter. He was already working behind the scenes to rally institutional backing. She set the tablet down. "This came out today?" Lauren nodded. "An hour ago." Pam wasn't surprised. Word traveled fast, and Prescott clearly wasn't backing down. Before she could respond, Lauren hesitated. "There's more," she said carefully. Pam glanced up, unreadable. "Go on." Lauren handed her another document, this one printed. Pam skimmed the first few lines, her pulse steady, but her mind racing. Attorney Pamela Bondi conducted herself in a manner that disrupted courtroom proceedings, challenged judicial authority inappropriately, and engaged in behavior unbecoming of an officer of the court. Pam let out a short, humorless laugh. "Unbecoming?" she murmured, shaking her head. "That's rich," Lauren sighed. "It's retaliation, pure and simple." Pam leaned back in her chair, tapping her fingers against the armrest. Prescott wasn't just looking for payback. He was trying to set an example he had lost in his own courtroom. And now, he was using the system to reassert his power. By filing this formal complaint, he was trying to flip the narrative, But Pam wasn't about to let him. Prescott was no longer the judge who had overstepped his authority. He was reshaping the narrative, casting himself as the one who had been disrespected. And Pam? He wanted to paint her as the reckless attorney who had challenged him, not out of principle, but for the sake of defiance. Pam had seen this move before. It was a classic tactic: turn the accuser into the accused. Reframe the story until the real issue was buried beneath bureaucracy and technicalities. But she wasn't about to let that happen. "What's the process on this?" she asked, already shifting gears. Lauren exhaled. "You have 10 days to respond. If the complaint moves forward, they could conduct a formal review." Pam nodded slowly. "And who oversees that review?" Lauren hesitated. "A panel of judges and senior attorneys." Pam almost smiled. If Prescott thought he could bury her in paperwork and quiet pressure, he had miscalculated. This wouldn't be handled in the shadows. This was about to become very public. Lauren studied her carefully. "What do you want to do?" Pam took a deep breath, then reached for her phone. "If Prescott wants to play games," she said, scrolling through her contacts, "let's play." Prescott expected her to defend herself in a closed-door hearing, accept a quiet reprimand, and move on. But he didn't understand who he was dealing with. Pam had built her career playing the long game, and now she was going to make sure everyone was watching. She didn't waste time. She knew how these things worked. Retaliation was most effective when it happened in the shadows. Prescott wanted to use the system against her while keeping the public in the dark. She wasn't about to let that happen. Finding the contact she needed, she pressed call. After 2 rings, a familiar voice answered. "Pam, I was just about to call you. Lisa Reynolds, a veteran journalist from a national legal affairs program." She had covered some of Pam's biggest cases before, and more importantly, she wasn't afraid to take on judicial overreach. Pam got straight to the point. "Lisa, I need you to listen carefully. A judge just filed a formal complaint against me for disrupting courtroom proceedings. But here's what really happened. He tried to fine me for wearing a cross. When I stood my ground, he backed down. And now he's using the system to punish me instead." Lisa was silent for a moment. Then she let out a sharp breath. "You're telling me a sitting judge is trying to sanction you because you called out his abuse of power?" Pam smiled. "That's exactly what I'm telling you." Lisa didn't hesitate. "I'm running this." Pam leaned forward. "I need it on record before they try to spin it. Once it's public, Prescott won't be able to twist this into a quiet disciplinary issue." Lisa was already on it. "I'll have a segment up by tomorrow, and I'll make sure legal analysts weigh in, especially ones who won't be afraid to call this out for what it is." Pam hung up, feeling the first stirrings of momentum shift in her favor. But she wasn't done yet. She turned to Lauren. "Draft a public statement. I want my position clear before Prescott and his allies try to muddy the waters." Lauren nodded. "You want to frame this as judicial overreach?" Pam shook her head. "I want to frame it as exactly what it is, an attack on personal rights and an abuse of judicial power. If this judge thinks he can punish me for standing up for myself, imagine what he's done to people who don't have a platform." Lauren's expression hardened. "I'll get it done." Pam exhaled, gathering her thoughts. Prescott had been counting on silence, but now the country was about to find out exactly what he had done. She didn't have to wait long. By the time she sat down with her coffee the next morning, her phone was already buzzing nonstop. News outlets had picked up Lisa's segment overnight. Social media was ablaze. The headline was everywhere. "Florida judge attempts to punish attorney for wearing a cross. Now he's under fire." And it wasn't just conservative media running the story. Legal analysts from across the spectrum, left, right, and center, were weighing in. A constitutional lawyer from Georgetown went on live television, calling Prescott's actions a blatant overreach with no legal standing. Another high-profile attorney posted a viral thread, breaking down how Pam's case exposed a dangerous precedent that needed to be addressed. Then came the statement Pam had been waiting for. The Florida Judicial Review Board announced that, due to the media attention, They would be reviewing Judge Prescott's conduct to determine whether his ruling had violated judicial ethics. Pam leaned back in her chair, exhaling. This was no longer just about her. This wasn't just about her. This was about every attorney, every defendant, every person who had ever stepped into a courtroom, wondering if their rights could be erased with the stroke of a judge's pen. Lauren walked in, holding up her phone. "You're going to want to see this." Pam took it and pressed play. There was Prescott standing outside the courthouse, cameras flashing around him. His expression was stiff, his statement short. Too short for someone trying to defend himself. "I have always upheld the integrity of this courtroom," he said. "The actions taken were in the interest of maintaining neutrality. However, I respect the judicial review process and will cooperate fully." Pam almost laughed. Neutrality. He was still trying to play that card. Lauren crossed her arms. "He's trying to save face." Pam nodded. "And failing. Because this wasn't going away. The Judicial Review Board had a decision to make. If they ruled against Prescott, it wouldn't just be a professional embarrassment. It would set a precedent. A ruling that protected attorneys like Pam from ever facing this kind of retaliation again. But even if they let him off without a formal reprimand, it didn't matter. Prescott had already lost where it counted most, his reputation, his credibility, his authority. Because after this, every attorney who stepped into his courtroom would know exactly who he was, the judge who tried to silence someone and failed. Pam took a slow sip of her coffee, then looked up at Lauren. "We won." Lauren smirked. "Oh, I know." Pam set her cup down. This fight had never just been about her. She had sent a message. Never let those in power strip away your rights without a fight. Because sometimes all it took was one person standing their ground to change everything.